In the shadowed corridors of Windmere Palace, where secrets whisper through ancient stone walls and loyalty is as fragile as morning frost, one moment of discovery threatens to shatter the carefully constructed facade of royal perfection. When duty collides with desire and protocol meets passion, even the mightiest crown can tremble. What happens when a future king discovers that trust, once broken, leaves scars deeper than any throne room scandal? Some boundaries, once crossed, can never be uncrossed, and some confrontations change everything forever. This is a work of complete fiction. All characters, events, and locations are entirely imaginary and bear no resemblance to any real persons, living or dead, or actual events. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Windmere Palace like a shroud, matching the heavy atmosphere that had settled over the royal residence in recent weeks. Prince Alexander stood at his office window, watching the gardeners tend to the rose gardens below. His reflection stared back at him, tired eyes, worry lines that seemed deeper each day, and the weight of a crown he would one day inherit pressing down on his shoulders. At 38, Alexander had spent his entire life preparing for kingship, but nothing had prepared him for the complexities of marriage within the confines of royal duty. His wife, Princess Catherine, had been the perfect choice on paper, intelligent, graceful, from an appropriate family, and beloved by the people. Yet somewhere in the maze of public appearances and state dinners, they had lost the connection that once bound them together. The palace buzzed with its usual morning activity. Staff members moved through the corridors with practiced efficiency, their footsteps echoing against marble floors that had witnessed centuries of royal drama. Alexander's private secretary, James Whitmore, knocked softly before entering the prince's study. "Your Highness, the schedule for today's engagements," James said, placing a leather-bound folder on the mahogany desk. His voice carried the careful neutrality that all palace staff perfected, never revealing what they might have seen or heard in the corridors of power. Alexander nodded without turning from the window. "Any word from Princess Catherine about the charity luncheon?" "Her Highness confirmed her attendance, sir. She's currently in meetings with the hospital board regarding the new children's wing." James hesitated slightly. "Your stepmother, the Queen Consort Camilla, has also confirmed her presence at today's events." The mention of Camilla sent a familiar knot through Alexander's stomach. His father's second wife had joined the royal family 5 years ago, bringing with her a warmth and vitality that had been missing from the palace for years. At 42, she possessed an effortless charm that made her popular with both the public and the press. But for Alexander, Camilla represented something more complicated, a reminder of possibilities unexplored and a connection that grew stronger each day despite every protocol that stood against it. The palace's east wing housed the royal family's private quarters, each suite carefully positioned to maintain proper distance and decorum. Alexander's apartments faced the gardens, while Catherine's rooms overlooked the lake, an arrangement that had once seemed romantic but now felt symbolic of the growing space between them. Camilla's quarters were in the south wing, far enough from the main family areas to be appropriate, yet somehow never far enough from Alexander's thoughts. As the morning progressed, Alexander found himself walking the familiar paths of the palace corridors. He knew every painting, every sculpture, every hidden doorway that servants used to move unseen through the massive structure. The palace was both his home and his prison, a place where every movement was observed and every relationship scrutinized. The sound of laughter drifted from the direction of the music room, where Camilla often spent her mornings. She had insisted on continuing her piano lessons even after joining the royal family, claiming that music kept her connected to the person she was before titles and protocol. Alexander found himself drawn toward the sound, as he had countless times before. Through the partially open door, he could see her seated at the grand piano, her fingers dancing across the keys with natural grace. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the highlights in her auburn hair, and her expression was one of pure contentment. In these moments, Watching her when she thought herself unobserved, Alexander glimpsed the woman beyond the royal facade. "Your Highness," came a voice behind him. Security Chief Robert Manning appeared at his shoulder, his presence both protective and slightly disapproving. Manning had served the royal family for 15 years and possessed an uncanny ability to appear whenever situations might compromise royal dignity. "Chief Manning," Alexander acknowledged, stepping away from the music room door. "Is there something requiring my attention?" "The afternoon security briefing has been moved to 2 o'clock, sir, and there's been a change in protocol for tonight's state dinner. Additional measures given the current political climate." Manning's eyes briefly glanced toward the music room before returning to Alexander. "Perhaps we could discuss the details in your study?" Alexander understood the subtle message. Even his presence in this corridor, listening to Camilla's music, could be misconstrued. In the royal household, perception often mattered more than reality, and Manning's job was to protect the family from both external threats and internal scandals. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and administrative duties. Alexander reviewed documents, approved charity patronages, and discussed upcoming state visits with his staff. But his mind wandered repeatedly to the conversation he'd had with Catherine the previous evening. Stilted and formal, two people going through the motions of marriage that had become more performance than partnership. Catherine was not to blame for their situation. She had fulfilled every expectation placed upon her, had mastered the delicate balance of public engagement and private discretion that royal life demanded. Their marriage had produced the required heir, young Prince Henry, now 6 years old and the light of both their lives. Yet somewhere in the process of creating the perfect royal family, they had forgotten how to be husband and wife. Lunch was served in the small dining room, a more intimate setting than the grand hall used for state occasions. Catherine joined him, elegant as always in a navy blue dress that complemented her fair complexion. Their conversation covered the usual topics: Henry's progress with his tutors, upcoming charitable commitments, family obligations that required their joint presence. "The children's hospital visit next week will be particularly important," Catherine said, cutting her salad with precise movements. "The new wing represents a significant investment, and our presence helps ensure continued funding." Alexander nodded, admiring her dedication while feeling the growing distance between them. Even their charitable work, once a source of shared passion, had become another item on their official agenda. "Have you given any thought to the summer schedule?" Catherine continued. "Mother suggested we might spend a week at their estate in Scotland. It will be good for Henry to experience a different environment." The mention of Catherine's family estate stirred memories of happier times, when their relationship felt natural rather than choreographed. They had spent their honeymoon there, walking through the Highland moors and dreaming of their future together. Now, even those sacred places felt contaminated by the weight of unmet expectations. After lunch, Alexander found himself with a rare hour of freedom before his next obligation. Rather than returning to his study, he decided to walk the palace gardens, hoping the fresh air might clear his head. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance heavy in the afternoon air. Gardeners worked quietly among the beds, their presence so commonplace that Alexander barely noticed them. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn. Camilla walked toward him along the gravel path, having changed from her morning attire into a flowing green dress that moved gracefully with each step. Her smile was warm, but careful, the expression of someone who understood the complexities of their situation. "Your Highness," she said with a slight curtsy, maintaining the formal address that protocol required even in private moments. "Camilla," he replied, her name feeling both natural and forbidden on his lips. "I heard your piano practice this morning. Chopin, wasn't it?" "Nocturne in E-flat major," she confirmed, her eyes brightening with genuine pleasure. "I've been working on the interpretation for weeks. There's something about the melancholy that speaks to me." They began walking together, maintaining an appropriate distance while their conversation flowed with the ease that had developed between them over months of careful friendship. Camilla spoke of her music, her charitable interests, the books she was reading. Alexander found himself relaxing in her presence, feeling more like himself than he had in years. "You seem troubled today," she observed, her intuition cutting through his carefully maintained composure. Alexander considered deflecting, maintaining the emotional distance that safety required. Instead, he found himself speaking honestly. "Sometimes I wonder if we're all just playing roles in a drama that was written long before we were born. The dutiful son, the perfect wife, the devoted family. But what happens when the roles no longer fit?" Camilla stopped walking, turning to face him with an expression of understanding that pierced his carefully constructed defenses. "Perhaps," she said quietly, "the greatest courage is admitting when something isn't working, even if changing it seems impossible." The moment hung between them, charged with possibilities neither could openly acknowledge. In that instant, Alexander realized that his feelings for Camilla went far beyond simple attraction. She represented authenticity in a world of artifice, genuine connection in a life surrounded by people who could never truly know him. "Your Highness!" The sharp voice of James Whitmore cut through the afternoon air. His private secretary approached with barely concealed urgency. "Forgive the interruption, but you're needed for an emergency briefing. There's been a development regarding tomorrow's trade delegation." The spell broken, Alexander stepped back from Camilla, the weight of duty settling once again on his shoulders. "Of course. Thank you, James." As he walked back toward the palace, Alexander felt Camilla's eyes following him. The afternoon had revealed truths that could no longer be ignored, feelings that grew stronger despite every reason they should remain buried. In the complex world of royal protocol, some boundaries were absolute, but the heart, it seemed, recognized no such restrictions. The emergency briefing proved to be a minor crisis involving security arrangements for visiting dignitaries, easily resolved with additional personnel and revised transportation routes. But as Alexander sat in the conference room, surrounded by advisors and staff members, his thoughts remained in the garden with a woman whose presence had become both his greatest comfort and his most dangerous temptation. Evening approached with its usual round of obligations. Alexander and Catherine would attend a state dinner, presenting the image of royal unity while privately navigating the growing distance between them. Camilla would be present as well, fulfilling her role as queen consort with grace and dignity while maintaining the careful boundaries that kept their relationship within acceptable limits. But as Alexander prepared for the evening ahead, adjusting his formal uniform and reviewing the guest list one final time, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted that afternoon. The carefully maintained balance that allowed them all to function within their prescribed roles felt suddenly fragile, as if one wrong move might send everything tumbling down. In the grand scheme of royal history, this was just another day in the life of the palace. Meetings attended, duties fulfilled, appearances maintained. Yet beneath the surface of protocol and tradition, human hearts continued to beat with desires that recognized no royal decree. And in that tension between duty and desire, between what was expected and what was felt, lay the seeds of a crisis that would soon test every principle upon which the monarchy was built. The palace stood as it had for centuries, its walls holding secrets and its corridors echoing with the footsteps of those bound by tradition, yet driven by very human needs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for both triumph and failure. But tonight, as the sun set over Windermere Palace, three people prepared for an evening that would mark the beginning of the end of their carefully maintained world. The state dinner that evening unfolded with the precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. Dignitaries from 12 nations filled the grand ballroom of Windermere Palace, their conversations creating a sophisticated hum beneath the glittering chandeliers. Alexander moved through the crowd with practiced ease, discussing trade agreements with ambassadors and cultural exchanges with ministers, all while maintaining the charming facade that royal protocol demanded. Catherine stood beside him for the formal photographs, her emerald gown complementing the family jewels she wore with such natural grace. To the outside world, they appeared as the perfect royal couple, united in purpose, elegant in presentation, the very embodiment of modern monarchy. But Alexander could feel the emotional distance between them even as they stood shoulder to shoulder. Across the room, Camilla held court with a group of cultural attaches, her infectious laugh drawing people into her orbit. She had chosen a deep blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes, and her natural warmth made even the most reserved diplomat smile. Alexander found himself watching her more than protocol would suggest, caught between admiration and a growing sense of longing that became harder to ignore with each passing day. "The princess appears to be quite popular with the delegation from Austria," observed Lord Chancellor Pemberton, following Alexander's gaze. His comment carried the careful neutrality of a man who had spent decades navigating royal politics. But Alexander detected a note of caution beneath the words. "Camilla has always possessed a gift for making people feel welcome," Alexander replied, forcing his attention back to the conversation at hand. But even as he discussed economic policies with the chancellor, part of his mind remained focused on the sound of Camilla's laughter drifting across the ballroom. The evening progressed through its formal stages: cocktails, dinner, speeches that struck the delicate balance between diplomatic necessity and genuine sentiment. Alexander delivered his remarks with the confidence born of years of public speaking, touching on themes of international cooperation and shared values. But when Camilla rose to speak about the cultural exchange program she had been developing, he found himself genuinely moved by her passion and eloquence. "Art and music have the power to bridge any divide," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom. "When we share our creativity, we share our humanity." These programs represent more than cultural exchange. They represent hope for a world united by understanding rather than divided by difference. The applause that followed was genuine, not merely the polite acknowledgement typically given to royal speeches. Camilla had spoken from the heart, and her sincerity resonated with an audience accustomed to careful diplomacy. Alexander felt a surge of pride that he quickly suppressed, aware that his feelings were becoming increasingly difficult to hide. As the evening wound down and guests began to take their leave, Alexander found himself in the position of saying goodnight to various officials and their spouses. The ritual of formal farewells would typically take another hour, each interaction carefully orchestrated to maintain diplomatic relationships and royal dignity. Catherine had already excused herself, claiming a headache that was likely more emotional exhaustion than physical ailment. Their marriage had become an endurance test, each public appearance requiring them to perform a unity they no longer felt. Alexander didn't blame her for seeking escape when possible. He often felt the same desperate need for solitude. "An excellent evening, Your Highness," said Ambassador Morrison from the Canadian delegation as he prepared to depart. The Princess Camilla's speech was particularly inspiring. "You're fortunate to have such an articulate advocate for international relations." Alexander accepted the compliment gracefully while internally wrestling with the irony of the situation. Yes, they were fortunate to have Camilla's talents at their disposal. But those same qualities that made her invaluable to the monarchy also made her dangerously attractive to a man already questioning the foundations of his carefully constructed life. The last of the guests departed near midnight, leaving the palace staff to begin the enormous task of cleaning and restoration. Alexander walked through the now empty ballroom, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. Flower arrangements that had seemed elegant hours earlier now appeared slightly wilted, and the remnants of dinner service awaited the attention of the night crew. Another successful diplomatic triumph. Came a familiar voice behind him. Camilla had remained behind to ensure that all the cultural attaches had proper information about the exchange programs. She had changed from her formal gown into a simpler dress, but somehow managed to look even more beautiful in the subdued lighting of the nearly empty ballroom. "Your speech was remarkable," Alexander said, meaning every word. The passion you bring to these programs, it makes a real difference. Thank you, she replied, moving closer but maintaining the careful distance that propriety required. But I could see something was troubling you throughout the evening. The weight of responsibility seems heavier lately. Alexander appreciated her perceptiveness even as it unsettled him. In a world where people constantly told him what they thought he wanted to hear, Camille's ability to see through his public facade was both refreshing and dangerous. Sometimes I wonder if we're all trapped in roles that no longer serve anyone, he admitted, echoing the earlier conversation in the garden. Tonight, watching everyone perform their parts so perfectly, I couldn't shake the feeling that we're all just very skilled actors in a play that lost its meaning long ago. Camilla considered his words carefully before responding. Perhaps the meaning isn't in the role itself, but in how we choose to inhabit it. You could have given a standard diplomatic speech tonight, but instead you spoke about genuine hopes for international cooperation. That authenticity matters. And what about personal authenticity? Alexander asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. What happens when the public role conflicts with private feelings? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither could safely acknowledge. Camille's expression grew careful, but her eyes revealed the same internal struggle that tormented him. I think, she said quietly, that sometimes the greatest service we can provide is to be honest about our limitations, even when honesty comes at personal cost. Before Alexander could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the ballroom. Chief Manning appeared in the doorway, his expression neutral, but his presence clearly intentional. Your Highness, forgive the interruption. The final security sweep is beginning, and I wanted to ensure you had no additional requirements for the evening. The message was clear. Their conversation had continued long enough to attract attention, and Manning was providing a diplomatic exit strategy. Alexander felt grateful and frustrated in equal measure. Thank you, Chief Manning. I was just finishing my review of the evening's proceedings. He turned to Camilla with formal politeness. Thank you for your insights, Princess. The cultural programs clearly benefited from your personal attention. Of course, Your Highness. Good evening. She departed with perfect composure, but not before their eyes met for a moment that contained volumes of unspoken communication. Alexander watched her leave, acutely aware of Manning's presence beside him. The security chief said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes about the delicate situation that was developing under his watch. The following days passed in a haze of routine obligations and careful avoidance. Alexander threw himself into his official duties with renewed intensity, meeting with parliamentary committees, reviewing military briefings, and attending charity events with mechanical precision. But the more he tried to maintain distance from Camilla, the more aware he became of her presence in the palace. He would hear her piano playing in the mornings and find himself pausing in corridors just to listen. Her laughter would drift from other parts of the palace during her meetings with various charitable organizations. Even her absence became noticeable. When she traveled to attend functions in other cities, the palace felt somehow diminished. Catherine seemed equally committed to maintaining emotional distance, throwing herself into her hospital charity work with an intensity that suggested her own need for escape. Their conversations became increasingly focused on logistics and schedules, carefully avoiding any topic that might require genuine emotional engagement. Young Prince Henry remained the one bright spot in their increasingly complicated family dynamic. At 6 years old, he possessed a natural warmth and curiosity that reminded Alexander of why he had once felt optimistic about the future. But even Henry seemed to sense the tension in the palace, asking innocent questions about why Mama and Papa seemed tired so often. Are you going to get divorced like Uncle Richard? Henry asked one morning over breakfast, referring to Alexander's younger brother, whose marriage had ended in scandal 2 years earlier. The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. Why would you ask that, Henry? Tommy at school says his parents got divorced because they were always grumpy with each other. You and Mama seem grumpy too. Alexander struggled to find words that would reassure his son without dismissing his perceptions. Sometimes adults have difficult decisions to make, but that doesn't mean we love you any less. Your mother and I are both committed to being the best parents we can be. It was an honest answer that avoided the larger question, but Henry seemed satisfied. Still, the conversation left Alexander deeply shaken. If their 6-year-old could sense the problems in their marriage, how long before the press and public began to notice as well? That afternoon brought an unexpected complication. James Whitmore knocked on his study door with unusual urgency. Your Highness, there's been a development regarding tomorrow's schedule. Princess Catherine has requested a private meeting with you at 3 o'clock. She asked me to clear your calendar for at least an hour. Alexander felt his pulse quicken. Catherine rarely requested private meetings, preferring to handle most of their interactions through their respective secretaries or during scheduled meal times. A formal request suggested serious business. Did she indicate the nature of the discussion? No, sir. She simply said it was a matter that required your immediate attention. Alexander spent the rest of the day wondering what Catherine might want to discuss. Perhaps she had noticed his distraction and wanted to address their marriage directly. Or maybe she was planning to propose some change in their living arrangements. The uncertainty gnawed at him, adding to the general anxiety that had become his constant companion. When 3 o'clock arrived, Catherine entered his study with the composure that characterized all her interactions. She had chosen a simple black dress and minimal jewelry, suggesting this was not a social call. Her expression was serious but not unkind, the look of someone preparing to address a difficult but necessary topic. Thank you for making time, Alexander, she began, taking the chair across from his desk rather than the more informal seating area by the window. The choice felt significant, establishing a formal tone for whatever conversation was to follow. Of course, Catherine. What can I do for you? She paused for a moment, gathering her thoughts before speaking. I think we need to discuss the state of our marriage and, more importantly, how it affects our ability to fulfill our public duties. Alexander felt his stomach tighten. The conversation he had been dreading was finally upon them. I've been thinking about our situation for some time, Catherine continued, her voice steady and controlled. We both know that our relationship has evolved into something quite different from what we originally intended. We're excellent colleagues, committed co-parents, and effective partners in our public work. But we're no longer husband and wife in any meaningful sense. Her honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. Alexander found himself appreciating her directness while simultaneously fearing where it might lead. I don't blame you for that change, she said, surprising him. We were both very young when we married, and we've grown into different people than we were then. The question now is what we do about it. Alexander waited for her to continue, unsure how to respond to such unprecedented candor from his wife. I have a proposal, Catherine said, her voice taking on the practical tone she used when discussing charitable logistics. I think we should consider a formal separation of living arrangements while maintaining our public partnership. We could cite the need for individual space to pursue our respective charitable interests. It would allow us both some personal freedom while preserving the stability that Henry and the monarchy require. The suggestion hung in the air between them, radical and reasonable in equal measure. Alexander felt a complex mix of relief and sadness. Relief that Catherine understood their situation as clearly as he did. Sadness that their marriage had reached a point where separation seemed like the most honest solution. What brought you to this conclusion? He asked. Catherine smiled ruefully. The same thing that's been troubling you, I suspect. We're both trying so hard to be the people we think we should be that we've lost sight of who we actually are. I see how you look when you think no one is watching, Alexander. You're not happy, and neither am I. We owe it to ourselves, to Henry, and to the people we serve to find a way forward that honors both duty and authenticity. Her words carried an unexpected weight of compassion that caught Alexander off guard. He had expected anger, recrimination, perhaps even demands for dramatic change. Instead, Catherine was offering a path that acknowledged their mutual failures while protecting everyone involved. This would require careful management, he said, his practical mind already working through the implications. The press, the public, the family, everyone would have questions. I've thought about that, Catherine replied. We could frame it as a modern approach to royal marriage, emphasizing our continued partnership while allowing for individual growth. Many couples in our position have found ways to maintain successful partnerships without traditional cohabitation. As they discussed the practical details of such an arrangement, Alexander felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, he and Catherine were having an honest conversation about their real feelings and needs. The irony wasn't lost on him that their marriage might become more successful once they stopped trying to force it into a traditional mold. But even as they talked about logistics and public relation strategies, Alexander's thoughts kept drifting to Camilla. Catherine's proposal would theoretically give him more freedom to explore his feelings, but it would also create new complications. The boundaries that currently protected them all would shift in ways that might prove even more challenging to navigate. As the afternoon sun slanted through his study windows, Alexander and Catherine continued their careful negotiation of a new kind of royal marriage, one built on mutual respect and shared purpose rather than romantic love. It was a thoroughly modern solution to an age-old problem, but Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that they were opening a door to a future none of them could fully predict. 3 weeks after his pivotal conversation with Catherine, Alexander found himself navigating the delicate early stages of their new arrangement. The official announcement had been carefully crafted to emphasize their continued partnership while explaining their decision to maintain separate residences within the palace complex. The press had responded with predictable speculation, but the palace's communication strategy had successfully framed the change as a progressive approach to modern royal marriage. Catherine had moved to a beautiful suite in the palace's west wing, closer to her charitable offices and the children's quarters where Henry spent much of his time. The physical distance between their living spaces was modest, but the psychological freedom it represented felt enormous. For the first time in years, Alexander could end his days in genuine solitude, without the constant awareness of performing for someone who knew him too well to be fooled by his public persona. The change had also created unexpected opportunities. With Catherine managing her own schedule from her new headquarters, Alexander found himself with more autonomy in his daily routine. Their public appearances together were now planned events rather than default expectations, and their private interactions had taken on a warmth that had been absent for years. "You seem more relaxed lately," Camilla observed during one of their increasingly frequent encounters in the palace corridors. They had developed a careful dance of coincidental meetings. Alexander's morning walks through the garden often coincided with Camilla's return from her charitable visits, and their paths crossed with suspicious regularity in the library, the conservatory, and the quiet alcoves where she liked to read. Perhaps, Alexander admitted, allowing himself to smile more freely than he had in months. Sometimes change, even difficult change, brings unexpected benefits. They were walking through the portrait gallery, a long corridor lined with paintings of Alexander's ancestors stretching back 4 centuries. The morning light streaming through the tall windows created pools of illumination that they moved through like dancers in a carefully choreographed ballet. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding authenticity," Camilla continued, her voice taking on the thoughtful tone that Alexander had come to treasure. "There's something liberating about acknowledging that the roles we're expected to play might not be the ones that serve us best." Alexander felt his pulse quicken. Their conversations had grown increasingly philosophical over the past weeks, touching on themes of duty, desire, and the courage required to choose authenticity over expectation. But there was always an undercurrent of deeper meaning, a sense that they were discussing their own situation through the safe medium of abstract concepts. "Sometimes I wonder," Alexander said carefully, "what our ancestors would think of our modern struggles. They seem to accept arranged marriages and predetermined fates with such apparent equanimity. Camilla paused before a portrait of King Edmund III, a stern-faced monarch from the 17th century who had famously maintained 3 separate households for his wife, his mistress, and his scholarly pursuits. Perhaps they simply had different strategies for managing the conflict between duty and desire, she suggested with a slight smile. King Edmund there managed to honor his royal obligations while pursuing his personal interests quite successfully. The reference was dangerously close to their current situation, and Alexander felt both thrilled and terrified by her boldness. Are you suggesting that historical precedent might justify creative interpretations of royal protocol? I'm suggesting, Camilla replied, moving closer to examine the painting's details, that human nature remains constant even when circumstances change. The heart wants what it wants, regardless of titles or expectations. The moment hung between them, charged with possibilities that neither could directly acknowledge. Alexander found himself studying Camilla's profile as she gazed at the ancient painting, noting the way the morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair and the gentle curve of her smile. "Your Highness," came a familiar voice from the gallery entrance. James Whitmore approached with his usual diplomatic urgency, but Alexander detected a note of particular concern in his private secretary's expression. "James, what is it?" "Sir, there's been a development that requires your immediate attention. Chief Manning is waiting in your study, and he's requested that the meeting be completely confidential." Alexander felt a chill of apprehension. Security briefings that required such secrecy usually involve threats to the royal family or potential scandals that could damage the monarchy's reputation. "Of course. Princess Camilla, please excuse me." "Certainly, Your Highness. I hope everything is well." As Alexander walked toward his study, his mind raced through possible explanations for Manning's urgent request. Had their carefully managed separation from Catherine created unexpected security vulnerabilities? Was there some external threat that he needed to address? And this possibility made his stomach clench, had someone discovered the growing intimacy of his relationship with Camilla? Chief Manning was indeed waiting in the study, his usually impassive expression showing signs of genuine concern. He had served the royal family long enough to maintain his composure under virtually any circumstances, so his visible anxiety suggested a situation of unusual gravity. "Chief Manning," James indicated this was urgent. "Sir, I'm afraid we have a situation that requires delicate handling." Manning opened a folder containing several photographs and documents. "We've become aware of some irregular surveillance activities that may compromise the security of certain family members." Alexander felt his blood turn cold. "What kind of surveillance?" "It appears that a member of the household staff has been documenting and photographing private interactions between family members. The individual in question is Marcus Thompson, one of the junior security guards who has access to most areas of the palace." Manning placed several photographs on the desk, each one showing Alexander and Camilla in various locations throughout the palace. The images themselves were not scandalous. They showed conversations, walks through the gardens, moments of laughter in the library. But, taken together, they painted a clear picture of a relationship that extended far beyond the boundaries of appropriate royal conduct. "How long has this been going on?" Alexander asked, his voice tighter than he intended. "Based on the timestamps on these digital files, at least 6 weeks. Thompson appears to have been quite systematic in his documentation." Manning's expression grew even more serious. "Sir, there's something else. We intercepted communications suggesting that Thompson may have been acting on behalf of external interests, specifically certain media outlets known for their aggressive coverage of royal scandal." The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow. Not only had his growing relationship with Camilla been discovered and documented, but the evidence was potentially in the hands of journalists who would have no hesitation in destroying both their reputations and the monarchy's stability. "What do we know about Thompson's current situation? Has he been confronted?" "Not yet, sir. We discovered his activities during a routine security audit of digital systems. Thompson is currently on duty in the East Wing, and he's unaware that we've uncovered his operation." Alexander's mind raced through the implications and possible responses. Thompson's betrayal represented more than just a security breach. It threatened to expose feelings and relationships that could destabilize not just their personal lives, but the entire royal institution. What are your recommendations, Chief? Sir, we need to contain this situation immediately. Thompson must be detained and questioned, his communications monitored, and any materials he's gathered secured. But there's also the question of how to address the underlying situation that made such surveillance potentially damaging. Manning's careful phrasing couldn't disguise the real question. What was Alexander prepared to do about his relationship with Camilla to prevent further compromise? I understand your concerns, Chief. Please proceed with Thompson's detention, but I want to be present for the questioning. This is a matter that requires careful personal attention. Of course, sir. There's one other complication. Princess Camilla is scheduled to be in the East Wing for a meeting with the children's charity representatives in approximately 30 minutes. If we detain Thompson now, she may witness the operation. Alexander considered the options. Delaying Thompson's detention risked giving him time to transmit additional materials or become suspicious of increased security activity. But allowing Camilla to witness his arrest would certainly raise questions that might be difficult to answer. Proceed with the detention, Alexander decided. I'll handle any complications with Princess Camilla personally. Manning nodded grimly and departed to coordinate the operation. Alexander remained in his study, staring at the photographs that documented what had been the most genuine relationship he'd experienced in years. The images captured moments of connection that he treasured, but viewed through the lens of security concerns and potential scandal, they appeared as evidence of royal impropriety. 20 minutes later, the sound of raised voices echoed from the direction of the East Wing. Alexander immediately left his study and hurried toward the commotion, arriving to find a small crowd gathered near the children's charity offices. Through the cluster of staff members and security personnel, he could see Thompson being escorted away in handcuffs, his face flushed with anger and defiance. And there, standing near the office entrance with an expression of shocked confusion, was Camilla. What's happening? She asked as Alexander approached. They arrested Marcus, but no one will explain why. There's been a security incident, Alexander replied carefully, aware that several staff members were within hearing range. Chief Manning will provide a full briefing once the situation is resolved. But Camilla's intuitive intelligence was already working. Alexander could see her processing the connection between the arrest and the unusual tension that had surrounded their interactions lately. Her expression shifted from confusion to concern to a dawning awareness that made his heart sink. Alexander, she said quietly, using his given name for the first time in public, is this connected to us? The question hung in the air, witnessed by at least 6 staff members who would undoubtedly discuss this moment throughout the palace within hours. Alexander felt the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could deflect, maintain the careful boundaries that had protected them both, or acknowledge the truth that was becoming increasingly difficult to hide. Perhaps we should continue this conversation privately, he suggested, offering his arm with formal politeness while his eyes conveyed depths of concern that protocol couldn't disguise. They walked in tense silence toward Alexander's study, both aware that the careful equilibrium they had maintained for months was suddenly and irrevocably shattered. The arrest of Marcus Thompson had transformed their private struggle into a security crisis that would require immediate and decisive action. Once inside the study with the door firmly closed, Camilla's composure finally cracked. Tell me honestly, was Marcus documenting our interactions? Is that what this is about? Alexander's silence provided all the confirmation she needed. Oh God, she whispered, sinking into one of the leather chairs. How much do they have? What kind of evidence? Photographs, mostly. Conversations in the gardens, walks through the palace, moments when we thought ourselves unobserved. Alexander moved to pour them both a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly as he processed the implications. Manning believes Thompson may have been working with journalists. Camilla closed her eyes and Alexander could see her brilliant mind working through the potential consequences. Not just for themselves, but for Catherine, for young Henry, for the monarchy itself. "We have to end this," she said finally, her voice steady but hollow. "Whatever this relationship has become, we have to stop it completely. The risk to everyone involved is too great." "Camilla, no," she interrupted, standing with sudden resolution. "We've been selfish, Alexander. We've indulged feelings that we knew could hurt innocent people. Catherine doesn't deserve to have her private arrangements exposed because we couldn't maintain appropriate boundaries. Henry doesn't deserve to grow up under the shadow of his father's scandal." Her words cut deeply because they echoed Alexander's own conscience. He had known from the beginning that their growing intimacy was dangerous. Yet he had allowed it to continue because it filled a void in his life that he had stopped believing could ever be satisfied. "What are you proposing?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "I'm proposing that I leave Windmere Palace. Not immediately. That would only fuel speculation, but soon. I can cite health concerns or a desire to focus on international charity work. Something that removes me from daily proximity to you while allowing us both to preserve our dignity." The suggestion hit Alexander harder than he had expected. The thought of Camilla leaving, of returning to the emotional isolation that had characterized his life before she arrived, felt unbearable. Yet he couldn't argue with her logic. "There might be other solutions," he said weakly. "Ways to manage the situation without such drastic measures." Camilla moved closer, and for a moment her careful composure slipped to reveal the pain beneath. "Alexander, what we've shared these past months has been precious to me. More precious than I should probably admit. But look what it's led to: security breaches, potential scandals, and risks to people we both care about. Sometimes love means making choices that protect others, even when those choices break our hearts." The word love hung between them, the first time either had spoken it aloud. Alexander felt simultaneously elated and devastated. Elated that she had finally acknowledged the depth of their connection, devastated that she was using it as justification for ending their relationship. "I need time to think," he said finally, "to consider all the implications and explore every possible option." "Of course," Camilla replied, her royal training reasserting itself. "But, Alexander, please don't let hope for an impossible solution prevent you from making the choices that honor your responsibilities." After she left, Alexander stood alone in his study, staring out at the gardens where they had shared so many meaningful conversations. The afternoon light that had seemed warm and promising earlier now felt harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the wreckage of a relationship that had brought him more happiness than he had known was possible. The photographs still lay on his desk, evidence of moments he would treasure forever and regret equally. In trying to find authenticity within the constraints of royal duty, he had created a situation that threatened everything he had spent his life trying to protect. The next few hours would require him to make decisions that would shape not just his future, but the futures of everyone he loved. And for the first time in his adult life, Alexander genuinely had no idea what the right choice might be. The interrogation of Marcus Thompson took place in a windowless security office deep within the palace's administrative wing. Alexander sat beside Chief Manning, watching the young guard squirm under the weight of evidence that had been laid before him. Thompson was 26, had worked at the palace for 18 months, and, until this moment, had maintained an exemplary service record. "The digital forensics are quite clear, Mr. Thompson," Manning said calmly, spreading printouts of file transfers and communications across the metal table. "Over the past 6 weeks, you've systematically photographed and documented interactions between His Royal Highness and Princess Camilla, then transmitted these materials to external contacts." Thompson's face had gone pale, but his jaw remained set in defiant denial. "I don't know what you're talking about. Those files could have come from anywhere, including your personal device, which we recovered from your locker." Manning placed Thompson's phone on the table, its screen displaying a folder labeled Royal Documentation containing dozens of compromising photographs. "And The encrypted messaging app you use to communicate with Sarah Mitchell at the Daily Chronicle. At the mention of Sarah Mitchell's name, Thompson's composure finally cracked. The Daily Chronicle was notorious for its aggressive coverage of royal scandals, and Sarah Mitchell was their most ruthless investigative journalist. If she had obtained evidence of Alexander's relationship with Camilla, the consequences would be catastrophic. "Look," Thompson said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. "Sarah approached me months ago. She said the public had a right to know the truth about what happens behind palace walls. She made it sound like I'd be performing a public service." Alexander felt his anger building, but forced himself to remain silent. Manning had insisted that his presence would be more effective if Thompson wasn't constantly reminded of the royal authority he had betrayed. "And the payment of £15,000 deposited into your account last week," Manning continued remorselessly. "Was that also part of your public service?" Thompson's shoulders sagged as he realized the futility of continued denial. "They promised me protection, said I'd be seen as a whistleblower, not a traitor." "What specific materials have you provided to MS Mitchell?" This was the crucial question. How much damage had already been done, and what could still be contained? "Photographs mostly. Conversations I overheard. Times when they met in private areas of the palace." Thompson's voice grew smaller with each admission. "Sarah said she needed proof of inappropriate conduct to justify publication." Alexander's hands clenched involuntarily. The idea of private moments with Camilla being dissected by tabloid journalists and offered up for public consumption made him physically ill. "When did you last communicate with Ms. Mitchell?" Manning asked. 2 days ago. She said she was preparing a major story and needed just a few more pieces of evidence to ensure it would withstand legal challenges." The timeline sent a chill through Alexander. If Sarah Mitchell was in the final stages of preparing her exposé, they might have only days before the story broke publicly. Once that happened, no amount of damage control would be able to prevent the scandal from consuming all of them. "What else does she know?" Manning pressed. "Beyond what you provided, what other sources might she have?" Thompson hesitated, and Alexander could see him weighing the consequences of further cooperation against the benefits of continued defiance. "She mentioned having sources among the cleaning staff, people who had access to areas where private conversations might take place." Thompson looked directly at Alexander for the first time. "I'm sorry, Your Highness. I never intended for it to go this far." The apology felt hollow, but Alexander could see genuine remorse in the young man's eyes. Thompson had been manipulated by professionals who understood exactly how to exploit idealism and financial desperation. After the interrogation, Alexander and Manning walked grimly back toward the main palace complex. The late afternoon shadows stretched across the courtyards, and the familiar beauty of the grounds felt tainted by the knowledge that every corner might have been the scene of surveillance. "What are our options?" Alexander asked. "Limited and unsatisfying," Manning replied bluntly. "We can pursue criminal charges against Thompson, but that would require publicly acknowledging what he was documenting. We can attempt to negotiate with the Daily Chronicle, but Sarah Mitchell has never shown interest in reasonable compromise. Or we can prepare for the worst-case scenario: full disclosure, crisis management, and damage limitation." The prospect of voluntary disclosure felt both terrifying and oddly liberating. Alexander had spent months struggling with the contradiction between his public duties and private feelings. Perhaps honesty, whatever its costs, would be preferable to the continued weight of deception. "I need to discuss this with Princess Camilla and Princess Catherine," Alexander said. "They deserve to understand the situation fully before any decisions are made." "Sir, I would strongly recommend limiting the number of people involved in these discussions. The more individuals who know about our security breach, the greater the risk of additional leaks." Alexander understood Manning's concern, but the thought of making decisions about Camilla's future without her input felt unconscionable. And Catherine, despite their separation, remained his partner in managing the royal family's public image. "Arrange a private meeting for this evening. My study, 8 o'clock. You, myself, Princess Camilla and Princess Catherine. Complete confidentiality. Manning nodded reluctantly. Very well, sir. But I must emphasize the time sensitivity. If Ms. Mitchell is as close to publication as Thompson suggested, we may have only a matter of days to implement whatever strategy we choose. The hours until 8 o'clock felt endless. Alexander tried to focus on routine paperwork, but his mind kept returning to the conversation ahead. How did one explain to two remarkable women that their careful efforts to maintain dignity and discretion had been systematically undermined by a corrupt security guard and an ambitious journalist? Catherine arrived first, her expression serious but composed. She had changed into a simple navy dress and minimal jewelry, suggesting she understood the gravity of the situation. Her greeting was warm but formal, maintaining the careful balance they had established since their separation. Alexander, James mentioned this was urgent but provided no details. Should I be concerned? Unfortunately, yes. But I prefer to explain everything when Princess Camilla arrives. Camilla entered precisely at 8, her usual punctuality now feeling like a precious reminder of all the qualities that had drawn him to her. She had chosen a conservative black suit that emphasized her seriousness, and her expression revealed the anxiety she had been carrying since Thompson's arrest. Manning began with a thorough briefing on Thompson's activities and the extent of the material that had been gathered. He presented his findings with clinical detachment, but Alexander could see both women processing the personal implications of each revelation. How compromising are these photographs? Catherine asked, ever practical in her approach to crisis management. Manning hesitated before responding. Your Highness, the images themselves are not scandalous. However, taken in sequence and with proper context, they clearly document a pattern of behavior that extends beyond appropriate royal protocol. Camilla closed her eyes briefly. In other words, they prove that Alexander and I have developed feelings for each other. The direct statement hung in the air, forcing all of them to confront the reality they had been dancing around for months. Catherine's expression didn't change, but Alexander caught a fleeting glimpse of something that might have been relief. And this journalist, Sarah Mitchell, intends to publish these materials? Catherine continued. Unless we can provide compelling reasons for her not to, Manning confirmed. The Daily Chronicle has shown little interest in protecting royal privacy in the past. Catherine was quiet for several minutes, her analytical mind working through possibilities and consequences. When she finally spoke, her words surprised everyone. Perhaps this isn't entirely catastrophic, she said slowly. The public already knows about our separation, and they've been remarkably understanding about our decision to prioritize our individual charitable work over traditional marriage expectations. Alexander's relationship with Camilla, properly presented, might actually humanize our situation. Alexander stared at his wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, in amazement. Catherine, are you suggesting that we acknowledge the relationship publicly? I'm suggesting that we consider controlling the narrative rather than allowing it to be controlled for us. Catherine turned to Camilla. Obviously, this would require your consent and participation, but a carefully managed disclosure might be preferable to a tabloid expose. Camilla looked equally stunned. You would support such an approach, even though it would inevitably create scandal? The scandal is coming regardless, Catherine replied pragmatically. The question is whether we shape it or allow others to shape it for us. I've known for months that you and Alexander had developed feelings for each other. I've also known that you've both tried to honor appropriate boundaries despite those feelings. The revelation that Catherine had been aware of their relationship all along added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Alexander felt simultaneously grateful for her understanding and guilty that his careful discretion had been so transparent. What exactly are you proposing? He asked. Catherine leaned forward, her expression taking on the focused intensity she brought to her most challenging charitable projects. A joint statement, carefully crafted to acknowledge that Alexander and Camilla have developed a meaningful relationship during a period when our marriage was already evolving. We emphasize the mutual respect among all parties, our shared commitment to Henry's well-being, and our modern approach to royal relationships. And the public reaction? Camilla asked quietly. Will be mixed, but manageable, Catherine replied confidently. The younger generation already views traditional royal marriage arrangements as outdated. The older generation values honesty and dignity. If we handle this properly, we might actually strengthen public support for the monarchy by demonstrating that we're capable of adapting to modern realities. Manning looked deeply uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Your Highnesses, I must point out the risks of such an approach. Once we acknowledge the relationship publicly, we lose all control over how the story develops. Additional details, speculation about timeline, and intimacy levels, comparisons to historical royal scandals. All of that becomes fair game for media coverage. As opposed to allowing Sarah Mitchell to dictate the terms of disclosure, Catherine countered. At least this way we maintain some measure of dignity and control. Alexander found himself caught between hope and terror. The prospect of ending months of secrecy and emotional tension was appealing, but the risks to everyone involved, especially to young Henry, felt enormous. What about Henry? He asked. How do we explain this to a 6-year-old? And how do we protect him from public speculation? Children are remarkably adaptable, Catherine said gently. Henry already knows that Mama and Papa are happier living in different parts of the palace. He likes Camilla and enjoys her company. We simply explain that sometimes adults develop new friendships that become very special, and that all the adults involved are working together to make sure he continues to feel loved and secure. The conversation continued for another 2 hours as they explored every aspect of Catherine's proposal. Manning raised legitimate concerns about security implications, media management challenges, and potential constitutional questions about royal remarriage. But gradually, the outline of a workable strategy began to emerge. They would prepare a comprehensive statement acknowledging the evolution of Alexander and Catherine's marriage, their mutual decision to pursue separate lives while maintaining their partnership in royal duties, and the development of Alexander's relationship with Camilla within the context of this new arrangement. The statement would emphasize their shared commitment to discretion, dignity, and the well-being of their son. Most importantly, they would release this statement before Sarah Mitchell could publish her exposé, allowing them to control the initial narrative and respond to subsequent media coverage from a position of strength rather than defensiveness. As the evening drew to a close, Alexander felt a complex mixture of anxiety and anticipation. For months, he had been trapped between duty and desire, struggling to honor his responsibilities while denying his heart's deepest longings. Now, unexpectedly, Catherine's wisdom and courage had provided a path forward that might allow him to embrace authenticity without destroying everything he held dear. There's one more thing we need to address, Camilla said as they prepared to conclude the meeting. If we're going to pursue this strategy, we need to be completely honest with each other about what kind of relationship we want to build going forward. This can't be based on fantasy or rebellion against constraint. It needs to be grounded in genuine compatibility and shared vision for our future. Her words reminded Alexander that even with Catherine's blessing and public acknowledgement, building a meaningful relationship with Camilla would require the same hard work and mutual commitment that any successful partnership demanded. The public drama was only the beginning of their real journey together. As they parted ways that evening, Alexander felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. The next few days would be crucial in determining not just their personal futures, but the future direction of the monarchy itself. They were about to embark on an experiment in royal transparency that could either modernize the institution or damage it irreparably. But for the first time in months, Alexander felt hopeful that authenticity and duty might finally be reconcilable. The royal press office of Windermere Palace had never faced a challenge quite like the one that confronted them on the morning they were scheduled to release the most unprecedented statement in modern royal history. Director of Communications Margaret Whitfield had spent the previous 48 hours crafting and refining language that would acknowledge Alexander's relationship with Camilla while maintaining the dignity and stability that the monarchy required. Alexander stood in his study, reading the final draft for the dozenth time, each word carefully chosen to balance honesty with discretion. The statement was scheduled for release at noon, giving them control over the news cycle and allowing them to respond to initial reactions before the evening broadcasts and next morning's newspapers. Your Highness, James Whitmore entered with uncharacteristic nervousness. MS. Whitfield is requesting final approval for the press release. The communications team is standing by, and we've alerted key media contacts that a significant statement will be issued shortly. Alexander nodded, setting down the document that would irrevocably change his life. The word seemed almost too simple for such a momentous decision. Their Royal Highnesses Prince Alexander and Princess Catherine wish to announce that their marriage has evolved into a partnership focused on their shared commitment to public service and the welfare of their son, Prince Henry. During this period of transition, Prince Alexander has developed a close personal relationship with Princess Camilla, which has grown with the full knowledge and support of Princess Catherine. All parties involved are committed to maintaining the dignity of the monarchy while embracing a modern approach to royal relationships that honors both duty and personal authenticity. Asterisk, where are Princess Catherine and Princess Camilla now? Alexander asked. Princess Catherine is reviewing the children's hospital plans in her study. Princess Camilla is in the music room. She thought it best to maintain normal routines until after the announcement. Alexander appreciated Camilla's instinct for normalcy. In just a few hours, their private world would become public property, dissected and analyzed by millions of people who had never met them but felt entitled to opinions about their choices. The sound of piano music drifted through the palace corridors. Chopin again, the same nocturne that Camilla had been practicing on the morning this all began. Alexander found himself drawn toward the music room, needing to see her before their lives changed forever. She looked up as he entered, her hands pausing on the keys. Despite the gravity of the situation, she appeared remarkably composed, dressed in a simple cream-colored dress that seemed to glow in the morning light streaming through the tall windows. "Any final doubts?" she asked, reading his expression with the intuitive understanding that had drawn them together from the beginning. "About the decision? No. About our ability to navigate what comes next? Constantly." Alexander moved to stand beside the piano, close enough to see the music she had been reading. "Are you frightened?" "Terrified," she admitted with a rueful smile. "But also relieved. These past months of carefully managed distance and stolen conversations have been precious, but they've also been exhausting. At least now, we can be honest about what we mean to each other." "And what do we mean to each other?" Alexander asked, realizing they had never actually defined their relationship beyond acknowledging their mutual attraction and emotional connection. Camilla considered the question seriously before responding. "I think we mean possibility. The possibility that two people can find authentic connection even within the constraints of extraordinary circumstances. The possibility that duty and desire don't have to be mutually exclusive. The possibility that love, properly honored, can strengthen rather than weaken the institutions we're called to serve." Her answer captured something Alexander had been struggling to articulate. The sense that their relationship represented more than just personal fulfillment, but a new model for how modern royalty might navigate the tension between public duty and private happiness. "Whatever happens in the next few hours, the next few days, the next few months," Alexander said, taking her hand in his, "I want you to know that you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope that I could be both the man the crown requires and the man I actually am. And you've shown me that it's possible to honor both love and loyalty," Camilla replied, squeezing his hands gently. "Not despite our responsibilities, but because of them. The moment was interrupted by the soft chime of Alexander's phone. Margaret Whitfield was requesting his presence in the communications center. It was time to release the statement that would change everything. The Royal Communications Center buzzed with controlled tension as staff members monitored news feeds, social media platforms, and international wire services. Multiple television screens displayed the major news networks, all currently focused on other stories, but primed to pivot to royal coverage at a moment's notice. Your Highness, Margaret Whitfield approached with the crisp efficiency that had made her one of the most respected communications professionals in the country. We're ready for your authorization. The statement will be released simultaneously to all major outlets, and I've prepared follow-up materials for international distribution. Alexander took a deep breath, thinking of all the people whose lives were about to change because of his decision. Catherine, who had shown remarkable courage in supporting their approach. Camilla, who was risking her own reputation for an uncertain future. Henry, who would have to navigate questions about his family's unconventional arrangements. And millions of citizens who looked to the royal family for stability and inspiration. Release the statement, he said simply. Margaret nodded to her team, and Alexander watched as decades of royal tradition gave way to modern reality with the simple press of a button. The initial reaction was swift and predictable. Within minutes, the statement appeared as breaking news on every major platform. Television anchors interrupted regular programming to read the announcement, their expressions ranging from surprise to delighted to skeptical. Social media exploded with commentary that spanned the spectrum from supportive to outraged to simply curious. BBC is leading with a positive interpretation, reported one of Margaret's assistants, monitoring the live coverage. They're emphasizing the mature approach to modern relationships. Sky News is more skeptical, but hasn't gone negative. The Guardian is calling it refreshingly honest, while the Telegraph is focusing on constitutional implications. Alexander watched the coverage with fascination and growing anxiety. Seeing his private life transformed into public entertainment was surreal, but the initial reaction suggested that their strategy might actually be working. Social media sentiment is mixed but trending slightly positive, another assistant reported. The younger demographics are particularly supportive, with many praising the honesty and modern approach. Older demographics are more cautious, but not overwhelmingly negative. Within the hour, requests for interviews, comments, and appearances began flooding the communications office. Foreign media outlets wanted statements about the constitutional implications. Relationship experts offered analysis of the psychological dynamics. Even late-night comedians were already preparing material for their evening shows. But the reaction that mattered most came from an unexpected source. Princess Catherine appeared in the communications center, having watched the initial coverage from her own office. Her expression was calm, but alert, the look of someone monitoring a carefully managed crisis. "How are we doing?" she asked Margaret Whitfield. "Better than expected, Your Highness. The narrative is holding, and we haven't seen any significant negative spikes." The international reaction is particularly positive. Several outlets are praising the royal family's progressive approach to modern relationships. Catherine nodded with satisfaction. "And any word from Sarah Mitchell at the Daily Chronicle?" "Interestingly, yes. She's released a statement saying that she's pleased to see the royal family embracing transparency and that her own investigation has been rendered unnecessary by this voluntary disclosure." Alexander felt a wave of relief. Sarah Mitchell's decision to step back from her exposé suggested that their preemptive approach had successfully neutralized the most significant threat to their reputation. As the afternoon progressed, the initial shock of the announcement gave way to more thoughtful analysis. Constitutional experts weighed in on the precedents and implications. Relationship counselors discussed the benefits of honest communication in managing family transitions. Religious leaders offered varying perspectives on marriage, divorce, and remarriage within the context of moral responsibility. But perhaps most importantly, early polling data suggested that public support for the royal family had actually increased following the announcement. The transparency and mature handling of a complex situation appeared to resonate with citizens who appreciated honesty over pretense. Your Highness, Margaret Whitfield approached Alexander as the afternoon communications briefing concluded. I think we can declare the initial phase a success. Obviously, there will be ongoing coverage and analysis, but we've successfully controlled the narrative and prevented any major scandals from emerging. Alexander felt cautiously optimistic, but knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. Public opinion could shift quickly, and their newfound transparency would require them to maintain higher standards of conduct than ever before. That evening, the royal family gathered for dinner in Catherine's private dining room, a symbolic choice that emphasized their continued unity despite their changed relationships. Henry, who had been carefully prepared for the public announcement, seemed remarkably unfazed by the attention his family was receiving. Tommy at school says his mum thinks you're very brave, Henry told his father over dessert. She says most adults aren't honest about their feelings. The innocent observation carried weight that made all three adults pause. From the perspective of a 6-year-old, their situation was simply about adults being honest about their friendships and feelings, a lesson that resonated beyond the complexities of royal protocol. What do you think about everything that's happening? Alexander asked his son. Henry considered the question with the seriousness that children bring to important topics. I think it's good that everyone is happy now. Mama seems happier in her new rooms, and you seem happier when you talk to Camilla. And I like Camilla. She plays good games and knows lots of songs. The simplicity of his son's perspective reminded Alexander of why they had chosen transparency over continued deception. Children deserved honesty from the adults in their lives, and the public deserved authenticity from their royal family. As the weeks that followed would prove, their decision to embrace modern approaches to royal relationships would face ongoing challenges and criticisms. Conservative voices questioned the implications for traditional marriage values. International observers analyzed the constitutional precedents. Media coverage would continue to dissect every aspect of their arrangements. But on that evening, sitting around a dinner table with his son, his former wife who had become his most trusted partner, and the woman who had taught him that duty and desire could coexist, Alexander felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. The carefully constructed facades that had governed his life for decades had given way to authentic relationships built on mutual respect and honest communication. The monarchy had survived its first experiment with complete transparency and perhaps even been strengthened by it. Outside the palace windows, the gardens were illuminated by soft evening light, the same gardens where Alexander and Camilla had first acknowledged their growing attraction months earlier. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and new opportunities to prove that modern royalty could honor both tradition and authenticity. But tonight, for the first time in his adult life, Prince Alexander was simply a man who had chosen love over fear, honesty over pretense, and hope over resignation. And in making those choices, he had discovered that the greatest service he could provide his people was the courage to be genuinely human. The palace stood as it always had, its ancient stones bearing witness to another chapter in the ongoing story of duty, love, and the eternal human struggle to balance what we owe others with what we owe ourselves. In the end, perhaps that was the only story that truly mattered, the story of people choosing to be honest about who they are and what they need, even when those choices come at great cost. 3 months later, as Alexander and Camilla announced their engagement, and Catherine published a book about modern approaches to family relationships, the initial scandal had transformed into something unprecedented, a royal success story built on the revolutionary idea that authenticity and duty could not only coexist, but could strengthen each other in the service of something greater than tradition alone. The future remained unwritten, full of challenges and opportunities that none of them could fully predict. But they would face that future together, bound not by the constraints of protocol, but by the freely given commitment of people who had chosen to trust each other with their truths. And In that choice, they had found something that all the royal traditions in the world could never guarantee: genuine happiness.